It's time to change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
So last week, we left King David on the west side of the Jordan River, where the people of the tribes of Judah had come to return David to the throne in Jerusalem, where half of the men of the other 10 tribes of Israel from the northern tribes, they also came to do the same. And if you remember, all the leaders of all these tribes, they had thrown their support behind Absalom against David, where they had never thought for a moment that King David would ever be able to win the war, where that was a miracle. And now with Absalom dead, King David is their only logical choice to be their king. And so now down at the Jordan River, a dispute broke out between Judah and Israel of who had more right to the king to bring him back to Jerusalem to David's throne. And even though Absalom's overthrow of the kingdom is over, and even though David has been given an invitation to return to be their king again, the country is still very fragile. But now, instead of fighting with King David, the 10 northern tribes in Judah, they're fighting over King David. Where Judah, they win the fight because they could yell louder. And it says here that their words were fiercer than the northern 10 tribes. And now, among the northern 10 tribes, who are called here Israel, and you'll find that all the time, the northern 10 tribes will be called Israel, and then Judah and Benjamin will be called Judah. It says that there is a man from Benjamin whose name is Sheba, the son of Bichri. And so he must have been some kind of leader in Israel. He was probably an officer of the northern 10 tribes who was chosen to be a part of the delegation to bring back King David to Jerusalem. And Sheba, he's not mentioned anywhere else in the scriptures. So all that we know about him is that he's a rebel. Where in other translations, it'll translate this word rebel as a worthless fellow or a troublemaker or wicked. But the actual Hebrew word used here is Belial, where in the New Testament, a man of Belial means a man of the devil. So now Sheba, he has a trumpet, and he doesn't like how the northern tribes lost that argument with Judah of who's going to bring back David to Jerusalem. So now he's playing the blues on his trumpet, and David has done nothing wrong on his part to cause this rebellion. It's just the fickleness of the people and the frailty of the nation, where only just 5 minutes before, everyone was fighting about who would be the one to bring David back, to where now just this one man, this rebel named Sheba, he declares, we have no share in David, nor do we have an inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tent, O Israel. And somehow here, Israel listened to him. And Sheba, with his words, just saying a few things, he dismissed the whole army of Israel. But he didn't declare war on King David, but he did insult him because he didn't call him the king. He didn't call him King David, but he says, we have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. So that's like him saying, we are not going to follow this son of a farmer. And so now Sheba, he leaves with the whole of Israel's army, following after him, and they're all heading north throughout Israel. And they're trying to gain support for this movement. And so it seems that now with Absalom dead and with Israel feeling insulted, Israel would almost follow anybody, even Sheba, even a worthless man. But the tribe of Judah, David's tribe, they stayed loyal to David. Now they're bringing him back from the Jordan River to Jerusalem. And then when he gets back to the palace, the first thing that David does is he takes care of his concubines, which are these second-class wives from his harem that he left to keep the palace. And what you have to remember here is that these women, they were all victims of rape. They've all been raped by Absalom, David's very own son. And so what David did when he came home is he supported them, where he didn't divorce them, but he provided for them as one would provide for a widow, someone who had lost her husband. Because David knows this is not their fault and that they're victims. But some sins and some crimes committed against some victims, that kind of damage cannot be undone. But they're still victims and they still need to be taken care of. But because they've been defiled by his son, he can't go back and have normal relations with them. And he couldn't give them to other men because they were wives of the king. So he can't do that because it didn't work that way in the culture. So I believe that David did the best that he could do for them to take care of them and to support them where he didn't have to, but he wanted to. So now just getting back into the palace and with Sheba's rebellion just getting underway, David, he didn't want to make the same kind of mistake that he made with Absalom. He didn't want to allow Sheba to draw all the people to himself to gain support without any confrontation. Where this rebellion, it needs to be stopped before it can grow legs of its own. Where David says this would be worse than with Absalom. So David determines that this army needs to be gathered quickly, and they need to be sent out right away. Because David believes he needs to respond to Sheba's rebellion, so he sets a time limit. And David, he gives his new commander, Amasa, 3 days to gather the army and then to report back to him personally in those 3 days. Because time is of the essence, where David, he wants to squash this and not give Sheba the time to gain support and start another civil war. Because he doesn't want Sheba to find a place of refuge and to be holed up in some secured city. But apparently, Amasa, he didn't grasp the urgency of the situation, and it may have been his inexperience, or maybe it was just his circumstances. He may have had trouble gaining the trust of the army to follow him. It doesn't really say, so we don't really know. But Amasa, he doesn't make his 3-day deadline that David gave him. And David, he's not going to wait for him. And David, he actually could be thinking here that maybe Amasa wasn't coming back, that Amasa, he may have turned traitor, that he may have taken Sheba's side in this rebellion, because Amasa did take Absalom's side in Absalom's rebellion against David. So Amasa, he could have hated David for all David knew. And David may think that he might not be so loyal to him. And at this time, Amasa, he hasn't proven any loyalty to David. And so David, he doesn't get his first choice of commander against Sheba, which would have been Amasa. And so he sends out his second choice, and he sends out Abishai, Joab's brother. Where we see here, though it would have been easy for David to send out Joab, he doesn't send Joab out as commander. Where Joab here, he's still relieved of his duty. Where David, he isn't going to trust Joab any longer. So David, he sends out Abishai with the army that he has available to himself. So Abishai is sent out with the Cherethites and the Pelethites, which is David's personal guard, which would have been like his special forces. And then Abishai, he's also going out with Joab's men. So this is the army that Joab had led, and he's sending them out along with the mighty men. And even though Joab, he isn't the commander of the army, we see that he also goes along too. And so Amasa, he's late to the battle. And he meets up with Abishai on his way back up to Jerusalem. And so he's on his way to see David with the army that he's gathered. And it says that they met at the large stone at Gibeon, which is only 4 miles northwest from Jerusalem. So nobody has gotten very far yet. And this is an area in Benjamin's territory with this parametric view of the plateau of the Central Valley of Benjamin. So this is an area where you can assemble a very large army. And Joab, He's all dressed for war, even though he's not the commander. He is still for the cause. So he has his battle armor on. And he sees his cousin Amasa, and because they're cousins, so this wouldn't be unnormal, walking over to see your cousin, who is also a commander in the army, to go greet him, because now you're on the same side. And Joab's sword, it falls out. And I don't think it was just this unfortunate coincidence, but it wouldn't have seemed like a threat to Amasa. It would just mean that Joab's a little bit clumsy. And so Joab, he goes down to pick it up. And we're told here that nothing seemed unusual, that Amasa, he never felt threatened by Joab. Where Joab here is asking him about his health and calling him brother because they're cousins. And what Joab actually says here is he actually says, shalom. So he's saying, peace. How are you? How is your health? And then by taking someone by the beard, that's what you would do when you greeted someone who was close to you. Because what you would do is you would move their beard out of the way to kiss them on the cheek, like the French or like the Italians. And that's when Joab, he thrusts his sword into Amasa's stomach and taking it out with his guts with it. And so Amasa, he falls to the ground with his intestines all hanging out, dying, not having to be struck again, which somehow this seems to be Joab's signature move, because this is the same way that Joab killed Abner, his former commander. That's way back when David made Abner commander of his army in place of Joab. So I kind of wonder if the dropping of the sword, looking like he's just a little bit clumsy and awkward, like that's his way of throwing someone off guard. He's kind of like a Columbo. He's kind of playing it dumb. He's acting like he's just a little slow, a little clumsy. You can't really trust a man like Joab. And this is murder. There's no justification for Joab and Amasa's death, because Amasa, he received a pardon just the same way that Joab received a pardon for killing Absalom. So now you have Amasa lying there, dying in a pool of his own blood. And Joab and Abishai, they're starting to take off after Sheba. But the men following Amasa, they don't know what to do. So they're just standing there and they're just looking, because they don't necessarily want to follow Joab, because they don't want to be in agreement with what Joab had just done to their commander Amasa. Were all these people, and a lot of these people that Amasa gathered in his army, these were all men who had just fought against Joab and against King David. So they're not really knowing what to do here. And so they just stop and they look until Amasa was dragged out of the road and covered. And then there was this man who's called one of Joab's men. He calls out, and he doesn't just say, well, who is for Joab? Let's go. Because not everybody there was for Joab. So he says, everyone who is for Joab and everyone who is for King David. Because Amasa's men, they could be for David, to follow David, without being so much for Joab. And so here we see that Abishai, Joab's brother, he just easily gives up his command and he gives it over to Joab, his brother, because he's used to being second in command, even though David put him in charge. And then they chase Sheba and his army and all the support that he was able to gather throughout Israel, which didn't really seem to amount to be that much support. And then they chased him all the way up north to a walled city called Abel in Beth Maacah, which is actually 30 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. And the Sea of Galilee from Jerusalem is 76 miles. So that means that they've chased Sheba now for over 100 miles. And so Joab with his army, they besiege the city of Abel in Beth Maacah. And this is siege warfare, which is a terrible warfare to commit against a city, because it's a horrible ordeal for its citizens. And Joab was really good at this type of warfare. We saw that. This can become a waiting game. And if you remember, Joab, they besieged the city of Ramah back in Ammon, and it took him about a year to capture the city. Because what happens is a siege is where the army, it cuts off their supplies. So it cuts off all their food and their water. It cuts off all their exits. So they have no way of escaping. And here we read that they have already built a siege mount and a rampart. And so they're starting to batter down their walls. And what's funny here is that Joab, he never once spoke to the leaders of the community looking for any terms of peace before attacking the city. And the city, they'd never sent anyone out to speak to Joab. But there's just this one unnamed woman who takes it on herself to go to the wall and to negotiate with Joab. And all we know about her is that she's wise and that she's a mom. And we always assume she's old because she knows the history of the whole city. But it doesn't really even say here that she's old. But she calls to Joab from the wall and she asks to speak to Joab by name. So she knows who's attacking them. She knows that it's her own country that's attacking their city. And here they are without any notice or no terms of war or terms of peace. And so she just asked to talk to Joab. And Joab here, he's not too busy to talk to a woman. And you kind of think he would be, but he does it. And he meets with her at the wall. And she gives Joab a history lesson about Abel, that this is the kind of city that solves disputes, that they're peacemakers, where others have come to them for help with their problems, in their disputes. And then she says, I'm of the peaceable and the faithful in Israel. I'm a loyal citizen among other loyal citizens. I'm just a mom. So why are you destroying us, the Lord's inheritance? We're loyal. We don't deserve to be attacked. And Joab, he explains he has nothing against the city of Abel, that it's only Sheba that he's after. And then she tells Joab that the city, that they're not in league with Sheba and that they'll toss his head out over the wall. And so they wait 5 minutes and that's what they do. Sheba's head comes rolling over the wall and the problem is solved. Abel goes on to solve other conflicts. They maintain their great reputation as problem solvers. Joab blows the trumpet and goes back to Jerusalem. And then we get down to verse 23, and this is the second time that we're given David's administration. So this is the administration of David's later reign, where we'll see that David's sons, they're no longer part of David's administration. And then we see that Joab, that he's back, where he's back as commander of the army again, because Joab is a hard man to get rid of, because he just kills all his competition. And so David, he probably just found it easier to keep him than to let him go, because he was never let go on account of his ability, and he was never even let go on the account of his loyalty, because he's loyal to him. It's really that Joab, he's a wild card. Joab will do whatever Joab wants to do. He'll even disobey his king if he thinks it's in his best interest or the best interest of the country. But he is loyal to David. But David, he never gets over the fact that Joab killed Absalom, and he will order Joab's death, but he'll give that task to his son Solomon in the early days of his reign. And then we see that David added 2 new officers to his administration, where there's Adoram, who's over the forced laborers. And so that would be all the prisoners of war, which would be the people doing the building projects, where it also mentions the revenues. And so this is the first time we hear of civil taxes in Israel under David. And then we start chapter 21. And what we need to look at here is that there's not really a timeline given for reference to these next events. So these next events, they're not given to us in a chronological order, but they do all occur in David's later reign. And so we know that this famine that we're being told about, that this occurred sometime after 3 years of David regaining the throne in Jerusalem. And this famine has nothing to do with David's sin, but is caused by the sins of King Saul. Where up until now, God has been gracious with Israel, where God has not caused Israel to be accountable for the sins of Saul. Because these sins committed against the Gibeonites, it means that they had to have occurred at least 33 years before this drought, because Saul has been dead now for at least 33 years. And the only reason that David knows that Saul is at the cause of the famine is because God revealed it to him. And we don't know how God revealed it to David, but the bottom line is that God could not bless Israel without justice being performed for the Gibeonites. And so now we have to remember, well, who are these Gibeonites? Because the Gibeonites, they were the lowest class of people in all of Israel. The Gibeonites, they had no rights because they made a covenant with Israel to become the country's slaves in exchange for sparing their lives. And that happened way back in the book of Joshua. And that's when Israel was told that they couldn't make any covenant with any of the native people of Canaan. And the Gibeonites, they were Amorites, which are a native people of Canaan. And back then, the Gibeonites, they deceived Joshua. And they said that they lived far away because they knew that if they lived far away, Israel, they could make a covenant with them. And Israel did. But when they did find out that they lived in the land, the Gibeonites, they gladly chose slavery over death. And God made Israel honor that covenant that they made, even though they were deceived. And the Gibeonites, they kept their end of the covenant. And so they've been Israel's woodcutters and water haulers for over 400 years. And we don't know when Saul did this because it's not recorded when, but at some time during King Saul's zeal, he attempted to exterminate all the Gibeonites from Israel in his crusade for ethnic cleansing. And so he slaughtered them, intending to wipe them all out. And one thought is that the reason Saul did this is because Saul wanted their land, because the Gibeonites' land was in the territory of Benjamin. And if you remember Saul, he always rewarded his leaders with houses and lands. And so he had to get them from somewhere. And so that might have been why he was attacking the Gibeonites. In 1 year of drought, that wouldn't have seemed like a big deal. David would have expected that from time to time. 2 years of drought, that would have seemed unfortunate. But after 3 years of drought, there's a famine. And so David sought the Lord about the drought, and the Lord revealed its cause to him. And before God will return his blessing to Israel, Israel needed to make restitution. And David here, he calls it atonement, but this is not like blood atonement, like a sacrifice for forgiveness. This is for a civil restitution. And so David, he asked the Gibeonites what they wanted. And they tell David that they don't want money and they don't want anything from Israel, that they're not holding Israel accountable, but they want blood for blood. They want Saul's blood, but Saul's dead. So they want 7 of Saul's descendants to be delivered to be hanged. And Saul, he killed many more than just 7 people. 7 was just a representative number, probably meaning the number of completeness. And David, he agrees in giving them 7 men. And God is actually requiring Israel to give up these 7 men, to give the Gibeonites justice. And though these 7 men that are to be delivered up to the Gibeonites, these 7 sons of Saul, they're not going to be killed in Gibeon. They're going to be killed in Gibeah. They're going to be killed in Saul's hometown of Gibeah. And that's because the Gibeonites, they were humiliated where they lived, and they were executed in their own hometown among their own people. So Saul's descendants will be humiliated in Saul's own hometown among Saul's own people.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh, oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,